In the quiet, rural town of Eldergrove, nestled between thick forests and rolling hills, there was a story that had been passed down through generations. It was about a child who never slept, a tale so eerie that it was often whispered among the townsfolk with a mix of fear and curiosity. No one knew if the story was true, but every household kept a wary eye on their children, especially when they struggled to sleep. One summer evening, a new family moved into Eldergrove. The Johnsons were looking for a peaceful life away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, along with their 8-year-old son, Timmy, hoped to start fresh in this serene town. Their new home was a charming old house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall trees and a vast garden. The first few weeks went by smoothly as the Johnsons settled in. Townspeople welcomed them warmly, though they couldn't help but share the old legend of the sleepless child. The Johnsons laughed it off as just another small-town myth, a harmless ghost story to entertain the children. Timmy, however, was a curious child. He often stayed up late, reading under his covers with a flashlight. He wasn't scared by the stories the townsfolk told. In fact, found them intriguing. One night, about a month after moving in, Mrs. Johnson noticed something strange. Timmy was still awake, staring out of his bedroom window. She walked over and gently asked, "Why aren't you asleep, Timmy?" "I'm not tired, Mom," he replied, his eyes wide open and unblinking. "There's something out there in the garden." Mrs. Johnson looked out the window but saw nothing unusual. She gently coaxed Timmy back to bed, thinking it was just his imagination running wild. But the following nights were the same. Timmy would be awake, staring out the window, insisting he saw something in the garden. Mr. Johnson brushed it off as just a phase. "It's probably just adjusting to the new house," he said. "Give him some time." But Mrs. Johnson was worried. Timmy was starting to look pale, dark circles forming under his eyes. He was becoming irritable and withdrawn during the day, and nothing seemed to make him tired at night. As the weeks went by, the situation grew worse. Timmy no longer just stayed awake. He began to avoid his bed entirely. He would pace around the house, always looking out the windows or peering into dark corners. His parents were at their wits' end, unsure of how to help him. One particularly restless night, Mr. Johnson decided to investigate the garden himself. He armed himself with a flashlight and ventured outside. The night was unusually quiet, only the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl breaking the silence. He walked around the garden, shining the light into every nook and cranny, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Just as he was about to head back inside, he noticed something strange at the edge of the garden, near the old oak tree. There was a small mound of disturbed earth, as if something had been buried there recently. His curiosity piqued. Mr. Johnson started digging with his hands. What he uncovered sent chills down his spine. Buried beneath the soil was an old, tattered doll. It looked ancient, with a cracked porcelain face and faded clothes. But what struck him the most were the doll's eyes. They were eerily lifelike, and seemed to follow his every move. Mr. Johnson quickly reburied the doll and rushed back inside, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. He decided not to tell his wife or Timmy about it, not wanting to scare them further. Timmy's condition continued to deteriorate. He no longer ate much and spent his days in a daze, often mumbling to himself about the whispers he heard at night. Mrs. Johnson, desperate for answers, decided to consult the town's local historian, Mrs. Holloway. Mrs. Holloway was an elderly woman who had lived in Eldergrove her entire life. She knew all the town's stories and secrets. When Mrs. Johnson explained Timmy's situation, Mrs. Holloway's expression grew serious. "The story of the sleepless child is not just a myth," she said. "Many years ago, there was a little girl named Lily who lived in your house. She was known for never sleeping, much like your Timmy. Her parents tried everything to help her. Nothing worked. One night, she vanished without a trace. Some say she was taken by something from the woods." Mrs. Johnson felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's one thing you can try," Mrs. Holloway replied. "There's an old ritual passed down through generations. It's said to protect children from whatever haunts the sleepless nights. But be warned, it's dangerous and must be performed exactly as instructed." Desperate, Mrs. Johnson agreed. She listened carefully as Mrs. Holloway explained the ritual, making note of every detail. That night, the Johnsons prepared for the ritual. They gathered all the required items: a circle of salt, black candles, and a mirror. They followed Mrs. Holloway's instructions to the letter, hoping this would finally bring peace to their home. Timmy was too weak to protest as his parents led him into the center of the salt circle. They lit the black candles and placed the mirror in front of him. Mrs. Johnson began chanting the incantation Mrs. Holloway had given her, while Mr. Johnson held Timmy's hand. The air grew thick with tension as the chant echoed through the house. Shadows danced on the walls and a cold breeze swept through the room. Suddenly, the mirror began to fog up and a faint figure appeared in its reflection. It was a little girl with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. She reached out towards Timmy through the mirror, her mouth moving as if she was trying to speak. Timmy's eyes widened and he whispered, "Lily." Mrs. Johnson continued chanting, her voice growing stronger. The figure in the mirror began to fade, and Timmy's body relaxed. For the first time in weeks, his eyes began to droop, and he fell into a deep sleep. The following morning, Timmy woke up refreshed and full of energy. The dark circles under his eyes had vanished, and he seemed like a completely different child. The Johnsons were overjoyed and relieved that the ritual had worked. Life slowly returned to normal for the Johnson family. Timmy no longer saw or heard anything unusual, and he slept peacefully every night. The house felt lighter, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over them for weeks dissipated. Mrs. Johnson decided to visit Mrs. Holloway to thank her for her help. When she arrived at the historian's home, Mrs. Holloway greeted her with a knowing smile. "I'm glad to see you and your family are doing well," she said. "But remember, the presence in your house might return if disturbed again. Keep the mirror safe and perform the ritual if needed." Mrs. Johnson nodded, promising to heed the advice. She left feeling a sense of gratitude and newfound respect for the old stories and traditions of Eldergrove. Months passed, and the Johnsons enjoyed their peaceful life in Eldergrove. Timmy was thriving in school, making friends, and exploring the beautiful countryside. The memory of the sleepless nights became a distant echo. However, one night, as winter began to set in, Timmy woke up with a start. He felt a cold draft and heard a faint whispering. The room was dark, but he could see the old mirror leaning against the wall. His heart raced as he remembered the figure of Lily from the ritual. Timmy tried to shake off the feeling and went back to sleep. The whispers grew louder each night. He told his parents about it, but they reassured him it was just his imagination. Mrs. Johnson even checked the mirror, finding nothing unusual. Despite their reassurances, Timmy's restlessness returned. He started avoiding sleep, fearing what he might see or hear. The dark circles reappeared under his eyes, and he became withdrawn once more. Desperate to help their son, the Johnsons decided to perform the ritual again. They gathered the items and prepared everything just as they had done before. Timmy was reluctant, but knew it was the only way to find peace. As they lit the black candles and placed the mirror in front of Timmy, the air grew cold, and the whispers filled the room. Mrs. Johnson began chanting the incantation, but this time, something was different. The mirror remained clear, and no figure appeared. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. The house shook, and a loud, piercing scream echoed through the halls. Timmy clung to his parents, terror in his eyes. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, much larger and more menacing than before. Loomed over them, hollow eyes glaring down at Timmy. Mrs. Johnson continued chanting, but her voice faltered as the figure advanced. Mr. Johnson, driven by fear and determination, grabbed the mirror and held it up to the figure. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering and weakening. Mrs. Johnson regained her composure and chanted louder, her voice filled with resolve. The figure let out a final, agonizing scream before dissipating into the air. The room fell silent, and the oppressive presence lifted. Timmy collapsed into his parents' arms, exhausted but safe. The Johnsons knew they had finally banished the malevolent spirit that had haunted their home. They buried the mirror in the garden near the old oak tree and performed a final blessing to ensure it would never return. Timmy slept soundly from that night on, free from the whispers and shadows. the legend of the sleepless child faded into the past, becoming just another story told around the campfire. Eldergrove returned to its peaceful state, with the Johnsons becoming a beloved part of the community. The town's old stories were no longer a source of fear, but a reminder of the strength and resilience of its people. And as the seasons changed, the old house stood as a silent witness to the past, its walls holding the memories of those who had lived and loved within them. The story of the child who never slept became a distant memory, testament to the power of family and the enduring spirit of hope.